Hi everyone, Teddy Bulbasaur here, and in this video, we're gonna be reacting to some of your hot takes regarding watches. So I asked on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube community, what are some of the hottest takes you have about watches so that I could react to them and say whether I disagree or agree with them. So we're gonna be going through some of those here today. And also, I'm a little under the weather today, so apologies if I'm not as soothing to listen to as usual. First hot take comes from Ryan. He says, in the next 5 years, Rolex authorized dealers will be a thing of the past. They serve no purpose for the modern consumer. Rolex will open their own stores. So in short, I would say I disagree with this in general, based off of the rollout mostly. Now, I think there could be a world where Rolex ultimately, years and years down the line, do limit their distribution just to be operated by the brand. But that's going to take a long time, and it probably would be a bad sign for the entire industry if that was the case, because that means production and overall output from Rolex would be way down from where it currently is. Here's the difference between Rolex and most other brands out there. One is that they can't narrow distribution the same way. Yes, they are closing more doors than they're opening, but Rolex is a brand that has to be in every major metropolitan market compared to some other brands like AP and Patek Philippe. Also, the majority of Rolex's sales come from wholesale sellers, not directly from the brand currently. So that would be a massive disruption for them to shift their focus in just a 5-year window. And Rolex is not about quick wins. That's not what they're trying to do. They're looking at the longevity and not disrupting. They're actually a company that really avoids risk quite well. They're all about steady, slow wins the race. Also, I wanted to just get a sense, looking at AP boutiques and Patek Philippe boutiques before coming to camera, so we have a baseline to understand what I mean by this. AP has 15 boutiques in the United States. They sell 50,000 watches annually worldwide. That's all approximate. Same with Patek Philippe, 40 boutiques though, and 70,000 watches approximately sold worldwide annually in 2023. Then you look over at Rolex, 1.24 million watches sold for Rolex. They have over 300 different retailers across the US. Think about having to shift that all over to brand operated solely boutiques. That would be a massive investment in a very short period of time. And I think in major markets like New York City, I could see a lot of this maybe shifting over to more a direct to the brand. Another thing to consider though is many of the boutiques operated by Patek Philippe, AP, these are joint ventures by a jeweler or another brand or a local jeweler that is collaborating with the company. So these are not boutiques that are solely being operated at times by the brands themselves. So it's important to consider that too. And a lot of the times when you're going into some of these boutiques, you're not even getting a direct representation of the brand itself, but a brand that is being operated by another brand. And as you start to get into the lower tier markets, it even makes more sense to have a joint partner in that market. You don't have to spend as much money to invest and get into it. Making sense of just a Rolex boutique versus a boutique that sells wedding rings and other types of watches, it just makes more sense for that type of owner compared to Rolex having to build out all the infrastructure in that market. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Do people buy Rolexes there? Absolutely they do. But is Rolex going to build a store there as a flagship? I don't know. These are big metro areas, but they're not places that I don't think Rolex is going to, in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, really look at trying to build these mono brand boutiques. So guys, as we go into 2025, a big goal of ours is to do more events. That has been one of the coolest aspects of operating a boutique here in the past year and getting to meet many of you in person. So if you want to stay in the loop about events that we're doing, hit the form down in the description below. This will give you early access to when we are going to have events upcoming in 2025. We're going to do many of them throughout the year. Just to give you a sense of what we did last year, we were doing VIP dinners. We also had watchmakers come in and do live assembly of several different movements, pop-ups with access to some of the rarest watches from the brands that we carry. And also we do larger scale events too. So last year we did a Grand Seiko event. Over 500 people showed up. We had a Japanese watchmaker come over from Japan, first time ever in the United States, doing live assembly of the 9SA4, their new movement released last year. We had a Kyoto trained sushi chef, a Japanese calligrapher, we had watches to see, we had the Kodo in the store, so if you ever wanted to try that on, that was there. We're trying to do more of these experiences. So if you wanna stay in the loop for this stuff, sign up, you're not gonna wanna miss it. Now we get another hot take from Jim. Jim says, spring drive is cheating. Building a purely mechanical movement that keeps time to -2 to +2 seconds per day is amazing craftsmanship. But once you throw anything electronic in there, It's just another quartz. Spring drive is a cool engineering feat, but it's basically cheating. So I big time disagree with this one. This is something that happens a lot when people look at the spring drive. They just see the accuracy component of the spring drive. And I think you maybe mentioned that it is a huge engineering feat that they were able to pull off here. But the spring drive is able to deliver on several points that make it truly groundbreaking in terms of what it's bringing forth. Now you have 3 different forms of energy, and how those are working with one another are allowing it to achieve something that no other watch movement has ever achieved before. First off, you have the mechanical power. And mechanical power, this is where you're starting to see the difference between just run-of-the-mill quartz and how it's able to counteract what is one of the biggest challenges of a quartz movement, that is going to have an external power supply that needs to be changed. That's why you have a battery change. With this having an oscillating weight and being able to be wound through a mainspring, this is going to completely bypass this concern, and one of the biggest challenges for a quartz movement. So you have that aspect, the fact that you do not need an external power supply. So outside of accuracy, that's a whole nother point. But then you get into what is a downside of mechanical watches, and one of the biggest downsides is friction. And I would say probably if you ask a watchmaker, friction is the #1 downside. So with a magnet fixed on that glide wheel with its proximity to copper wires, able to send an electrical charge, and then from that electrical charge gets from the integrated circuit back down the chain through those copper wire, then you're getting electromagnetic power, and how this is coming into play is it's acting as a brake on that glide wheel. So it's regulating itself without friction. In a typical escapement, you have the constant banging back and forth, the sliding of those pallets on the escapement wheel. There's friction happening at all of these points. This completely bypasses that. It's not even touching the component, and it's able to regulate itself. So now you're counteracting the external power need, now having it integrated within the movement itself through mechanical power. You're also able to counteract friction, and then the whole accuracy, that's just a new add-on. And if you look at different levels of Grand Seiko spring drive, you'll also notice that there are going to be actual spring drives that are more accurate than most quartz movements. If you're looking at the 9RA series of calibers, that's going to have half a second a day of accuracy. And these are pretty conservative measurements when you're looking at Grand Seiko and their spring drives. Half a second, plus or minus 10 seconds a month on those movements, 5-day power reserve as well. So there are multiple reasons why you can look at a spring drive and why it's unique. I don't think it's cheating. I think it's ingenuity at work. And the next hot take comes from Andrew Morgan. So Andrew Morgan leaving a nice little hot take on Instagram. He says the Cubitus is actually fine. Now, I tend to agree with Andrew that it is fine, but the problem is context matters. And I think fine for Patek Philippe is not the standard that they're striving for. But I think ultimately why so many people dislike the Cubitus, or why I had this huge polarizing feedback around it, was the lead up to it, the fallout after it, and the context surrounding it. I mean, let's think about it. You had a watch from Patek Philippe. This is the first new model family in a quarter century from the company. You also saw the 5711 get discontinued after being at its peak of popularity. So there was this idea of, would it come back? But then in its place is this watch. A watch that looks somewhat like the Nautilus. It has a case size that maybe some people are questioning, and it's coming off of years and years of anticipation, also with some teasing or maybe some leaks that were happening, which only doubled the mystique and all the fervor around it and people questioning whether or not it was real. Then after the fact, where it maybe doesn't hit the mark, you have Terry Stern doubling down and saying some unsavory comments, so people are even more mad. And then you had an ad campaign where other people didn't seem to like it as well. But I've been able to see it in person now, and it is a fine watch. It's perfectly fine. The worst part about the Cubitus, though, is not the watch. It is the packaging around it and the typical expectations to arguably the industry's most esteemed brand. Our next hot take comes in saying micro-brand expansion is the next quartz crisis. It's happening at a slower rate. Better spec for less money, which is what happened last time too. So I don't think the spec for dollar was the reason for the quartz crisis. Back in the 1960s, you had a totally different idea and definition of what a watch represented to most people in society. These were necessary tools. Mechanical watches were necessary tools and the only way to be able to feasibly tell the time at a glance. Now you have your cell phone, you have smartwatches, you have quartz watches, of course, and that changed the way that watches were perceived after that point. Mechanical watchmaking no longer was about being able to simply tell the time. It became a point of artistic expression. And the reason why we now like them is totally outside of this idea of telling time. So based off of this shift, now that mechanical watches are a totally different idea, I don't believe that we are looking at an apples to apples comparison. I get what you're going at, but that would be one thing I'd recommend. But then number two, and this is the main reason why I disagree with this, is back in the 1960s, the main people that were coming in and shaking the foundation of the Swiss watch industry were the Japanese and lower market providers of quartz technology. Now, who is the people that are providing micro brands all of the ability to produce their watches? It's specialists, and primarily it's movement providers like Eda, Sellita, Miyota, Seiko. Listen to what I just said with some of those brands. Eda is owned by the Swatch Group. Then you have Miyota, operated by Citizen. Seiko, say no more. They operate their own brands. So you have two aspects here. Brands are not going to provide, and you saw it with Eda, they cut off distribution for movements for certain brands that were starting to get to a certain threshold back in around 2008. So the same thing could be happening at any time for some of these micro brands if they get too big where they actually are causing disruption. The other thing that you have to consider here is that these brands are still making money from these micro brands ascending. They're getting checks in either case. And there are also many other smaller providers of components that we're not even talking about here, like Niverox. This is a company that provides many of the different balance springs and smaller components in the industry in Switzerland, and they're operated by the Swatch Group. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. The industry now is more consolidated than it was back in the 1960s. And through that consolidation, it is now able to be more sturdy in points of disruption. So the short answer here is I do not think micro brands are going to disrupt. But independents at the high end of things, if you're talking more about the hot horology, I would maybe get more on board with that idea that there could be more disruption there. But to say the quartz crisis, I think that's a bit extreme. Next hot take, a moonphase complication is more useful than a chronograph. So I think this is being slightly facetious here because chronographs typically just get a lot of hate as not maybe being the most useful of complications nowadays or the most useful of watches. So I'm going to disagree with this one. I love a moonphase. If you have a certain religious custom, and maybe you could even argue that a moonphase is more useful. But I don't agree with this. Chronographs in general, though, I think this is one of the problems with chronographs is because they are a design as much as they are an actual utility, you start to see this mix. And there's so many icons that follow the chronograph DNA that they have become overrated by some. The other challenge with chronographs is by nature, they have to be thicker because they are more complicated. They're more difficult to maintain. They're more expensive to service. And there's been this weird mix up because the designs are so favorable by collectors and there's so many icons, there's a disconnect between the amount of times that we see them. They're so ubiquitous, but they are more difficult to construct. And I think the overall interest around some of the icons that are chronographs, it becoming so useful back in the early 20th century to mid 20th century, and there's been so many brands that have tried so hard to develop their own chronographs that I think we've now maybe been pushing the other way because we see them and we've almost been desensitized to what they brought forth years and years ago. But then there's a whole other point where chronographs, and you could argue like a rotating bezel like this is maybe more useful for judging elapsed time or have a Zin 104 on for seeing a countdown for time than an actual chronograph is because of the larger display that you'll see compared to a chronograph. Next question. Horology content creators need to stop with watches you must buy now or don't buy these watches videos. Whether they discuss one brand or many, it isn't their place to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do with their financial decisions. One person's treasure is another's trash and vice versa. So I've never really made too many videos about this. I have done one video where I said watches to avoid, and it was more of just talking about general ideas, like saying that you shouldn't buy a watch that causes financial hardship, which I don't think is a hot take. And just like how you have an opinion, I think other people are allowed to have an opinion. But this is one of the problems with YouTube is you have to be usually positioning things more towards the negative end and getting people's attention. So this type of content, it gets people to click. So I understand why other creators do it. But in general, I agree with you. I don't think it is anybody's place to talk about what exactly is going to work for somebody else. A specific watch is definitely the case. There is no prerequisite to being a watch collector, in the fun aspect of all all of this, is being able to decide what is your taste and how that can be different than the rest of the crowd. We become more homogenous as we become collectors, unfortunately, and I think a lot of people look at the same watches over and over again, and that's fine because great watches are great watches. I mean, I cover watches on this channel because more people have interest in them, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm trying to reverse engineer what people ultimately want to see. But in theory, I like the idea where people pick out watches that are true to them, not true to the larger group. So I agree with you. I can't speak for what's going to work for all of you. All I can do is simply lay out the information. I think that's the same case for other creators as well. Hot take, Teddy Bulbasaur was named after the starter Pokemon. I see this funny comment all the time. I'm gonna set the record straight. Bulbasaur is coming for me. And I want to state that I came before Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur came out in 1996. That's where Pokemon came out in Japan. I was born before that. So if anything, Bulbasaur is copied after me. Just want to clear that up for everybody. Next hot take, dress watches should not be on a NATO strap. I don't like to draw lines on the rules of what people can do, but would I ever wear a dress watch with a NATO strap? I would not. Generally, I just think it looks a little foolish, especially with wild colors. Now, maybe you could get away with a simple colored NATO that's more monochromatic, and then you could look at a nice simple dial that maybe could work, but I've seen people put a NATO strap on a Longo 1 before, and I was thinking to myself when I saw it, you know, would that be my choice? Absolutely not, but it doesn't look terrible. But short answer though, I agree with you. Next hot take, Longines will ditch its value brand tag and will step into Tudor Omega price territory in less than 2 years. So short answer, I disagree with this. Now first, let's just acknowledge that Tudor's average retail price, around $4,000. Longines, I would say around $3,000. Omega is closer to $7,000 for an average retail price. So we're talking about probably 3 different tiers, but Tudor and Longines probably closer in the same vicinity given the average cost for one of their watches. Now, where I also disagree is that I think Longines has already done their change and where they're going to position themselves. And to understand this, you have to also know the broader swatch group. Longines sits in that $2,000 to $5,000 price range. Now, there is another brand that is similar to that, in Rado, but Rado is a totally different animal in terms of what they're doing and the watches that they create. Longines is their mass market brand that sits in this price tier, and they really sit there without having a true peer in what they're bringing forth. Longines is a $1 billion company, so they are a massive player in the industry. At the $2,000 range, that's where you're gonna see Longines making more like the Conquest, the three-handers, and as you get towards the $5,000 range, that's where you see higher complications like flyback chronographs, for example. But this is where I'm talking about understanding the swatch group's dynamics. They don't want to create competition between two of the brands. So if you look at where Omega sits, they have starting prices for their DeVilles right at the end, or the top end of what Longines is doing at that $5,000 price range. So right where Longines is starting to wrap up, that is where Omega comes in. So they're complementing one another. More proof of this is going to be something that I noticed that I didn't see many people call out. So a few years ago, Longines came out with a watch called the Ultra Chron. It was bringing back a 1960s design, really badass watch, high frequency movement on the inside. But there was one feature in their language around this release that I thought was interesting. They phrased this watch as being an ultra chronometer. So this is actually a new standard that they developed with a Geneva-based testing laboratory, Time Lab, to certify the movement as what they call an ultra chronometer. What that meant is that it was more accurate than COSC, and I can't recall all of the specifications that it was bringing forth. But what I noticed, maybe a year or so, maybe not even a year or so later, that ultra chronometer language totally was stripped away from the positioning of that watch. My hunch of why? It was starting to get maybe too close for comfort to Omega's master chronometer standard, and they didn't want these brands competing with one another within the group. That is just my own theory on this. I have no insider information on it, but I thought that this was an interesting tell into why Longines is positioned neatly below that of Omega, and there's no way that the swatch group would want Longines to be in the same position as Omega, because that allows them to have a more diversified portfolio. So you can feel assured that as long as Omega stays where they're at, which I think they are going to as well, Longines is also going to represent that one tier below in that $2,000 to $5,000 range. But all right, guys, that is all we have for this video, looking at some of your hot takes. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Thumbs up is a great indicator if you want us to do more of this. And if you want us to do more of this, leave some comments down below. Love to see the encouragement. Do you have a hot take? Do you disagree with some of my takes on these hot takes? Leave some comments down below also about that. Also check out TeddyBaldasar.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands. Each purchase from TeddyBaldasar.com comes with a full factory warranty, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and also how we're able to continue producing the content on this channel is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, absolutely love to have your business. Allows us to keep doing what we're doing here, and we love what we do. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.